Only in America.
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 This week on Only in America, connecting people through laughter, creating an on-ramp to talk about more difficult issues.
And we asked that person for their family history. Who was the first person from your family to come to the United States? Why did they come here? When did they come here? What did they do when they got here? Those kinds of questions. And then based on that, we create a song, we create scenes, and it's all fully improvised and made up in the moment.
And one entrepreneur's experience moving from India to Iowa and from a career in computer science to one in improv comedy.
My story in Iowa is very indicative of kind of the national conversation, which is that on an individual level, if you can connect with someone, you start to have a very different perspective than at the policy level.
From the National Immigration Forum, I'm Ali Nirani. Welcome to Only in America. Getting people to talk about or critically reflect on polarizing issues is incredibly challenging. But making people laugh and connecting over personal stories creates common ground. My guest this week created a show that uses improvisational comedy to educate audiences about immigrant stories. Vivek Venugopal is an improviser, comedian, actor, and musician. He's the director of revenue at Speechless Incorporated, which teaches an improv comedy approach to public speaking. I met Vivek in California earlier this year as part of the Emerson Collective's Dial Fellowship, a program strengthening the voices of leaders in education, immigration, social justice, the environment, and health. Vivek and his business partner at Speechless Inc., Anthony Veneziale, conducted a training for the fellows that day and later that evening performed a part of their improv show, Immigrants. But before we hear a bit of the show, let's chat with Vivek and learn about his journey from India to Iowa to the technology sector to helping people become better communicators.
Vivek, thank you. I really, really appreciate this.
Happy to be here.
And I feel like we should paint the scene a little bit here. How would you describe where we are?
Well, we are we're surrounded by pine trees. There's a fire pit to the right of us, and some pretty impressive people sitting around us.
I think I would call it idyllic.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, definitely idyllic. I'm not a huge fan of idyllic. More of a city person.
Yeah. I'm never quite sure if it's one L or two L's with idyllic. And where does the Y go?
Yeah, it doesn't. And why is it there?
Tell me a little about yourself. How do you find yourself in this idyllic setting with two Y's?
Oh, how far back should we go?
Where are you from?
So where am I from? That's a tough question to answer. Where's home is an even tougher question to answer. But I grew up I was born in Zambia in Africa. I lived there till I was 11. I moved to India. I finished high school in India, in Chennai, city of 10 million. And then I made the natural transition to Iowa for college.
It makes total sense.
Yeah, you've seen 100 movies about it. I don't need to talk too much about it. But I moved from a city of 10 million to a town of about 10,000. Was in Iowa for 4 years at a small liberal arts college, Grinnell College. Graduated with a degree in computer science, as all good Indian students do, except the ones who become doctors. And then moved to Chicago and was a software developer in Chicago. Had a quarter life crisis, as I called it, at 25. Optimistically, that's my quarter life. And went into nonprofit fundraising and did that for 5 years in Chicago. That brought me to San Francisco, and then got caught up in the tech wave, and then was a salesperson for software in San Francisco. Did that for 5 years, and then discovered my latest career, which is as an improviser and a coach for folks who struggle with public speaking and communication. And I work for a company called Speechless, and we work with individuals and groups on public speaking and communication using what we call improv thinking. So
pause there.
Yeah.
Before we I want to talk a lot about how you all do the trainings that you do.
Yes.
But before we get there,
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about Grinnell, Iowa, and what was it like to make that very subtle transition from 10 million to 10,000? There's
Well,
just a few zeros involved
yeah,
there.
there are a couple of zeros. Well, here's what's interesting. As a teenager in India in the 90s, I had two views of what America was. It was either Tupac or the Wonder Years. Right? I knew there were those two Americas. Those are the only two Americas I was aware of.
Baywatch wasn't part of this.
Oh, Baywatch was in there, but
Yeah.
Baywatch kind of fell in the Wonder Years universe.
This is true.
You know?
This is true. Yeah. Because I remember when I would visit Pakistan, like
Yeah.
everybody like, oh, you're from America. It's Baywatch.
It's Baywatch. Oh yeah. I understood geography, so I was under no illusions that when I got to Iowa, it wouldn't be Baywatch.
You looked at a map.
Yeah,
That's
I
a good-
did. I
that's
looked
a good
at a
first
map.
step.
And I landed in Chicago. I flew to Des Moines. I got picked up in Des Moines by a representative of the International Student Organization, and we drove into Grinnell, Iowa. And the thing that surprised me the most immediately was that the fire hydrants were painted pretty colors. And for some reason that stuck out at me, because I think in my mind there was this thought that fire hydrants are supposed to be painted red universally. And this town is so small that they had kids painting fire hydrants because, there's 3 streets. We know where the hydrants are. We don't need to mark them with red. I just remember that being such a big kind of epiphany for me. I was like, wow, this is a really small town. I had no idea. This was the first time I'd ever come to the United States. I had applied for colleges. I got a membership at the USCIS library in Chennai, and I grabbed Peterson's Guide to Colleges, and literally for months I had combed through and just checked off colleges that met whatever weird criteria I had. I applied to a lot of colleges, and Grinnell gave me the most money. Mm-hmm. And I came to Grinnell with the anticipation that I would stay there for a semester, maybe a year, and then I would transfer to a college that someone had heard of, anyone. And within the first 3 months, I fell in love with it.
Why?
For a number of reasons, right? So as international students, we got to campus 3 days before all the other, before the American students got there. And we all had host families. And it gave me an exposure to, Iowa, like the local Iowans. And one thing that people who've never visited Iowa, the Midwest, but Iowa in particular, don't quite understand, because people see, I think, the Midwest through a particular lens, is that the folks in Iowa are extremely friendly.
Extremely.
Yep. I mean, I did not ever feel with the people that I interacted with like another. I felt immediately embraced. I felt like I was part of the family. I remember walking down the block and a beat-up truck driving down the street, and a farmer who conservatively was probably about 120 years old look up at me and kind of give me the wave, right? A couple of fingers in the air, give me the wave. And I stopped and looked around, and I was like, does he just wave at me? There's no way he knows me, or that he thinks I'm someone he knows. But that's what Iowa was. And so I loved the people. The college was tiny, 1,200 students.
Yeah.
And I pretty quickly felt like I belonged there. Mm-hmm. And my first friends were people from all over the world. Again, those international students all came together. I met my first Pakistani person, and suddenly it was like this moment of like, oh, I guess we are very similar. Uh-huh. I mean, our childhoods were almost identical, in terms of the kind of media we consumed and our parents and all of these different things. And so there were all these kind of mini revelatory moments, and I just loved it. Mm-hmm. I loved being in a completely different culture, fully immersed, and just kind of absorbing everything that I could, to the extent that a lot of my friends did semesters abroad. And I always joked I was doing 4 years abroad, so I didn't need to do it. But I didn't go because I didn't want to miss a moment of college. I kind of wish I had now. but back then I just remember being like, why would I leave? I'm loving everything here.
And how did you explain it to your parents? I mean, were your parents still in Chennai?
Yeah, my parents are still there, actually. Yeah. I would make videos and send it to my parents.
Really?
I had like those giant camcorders. And so we have some of those videos, but I just remember a few of the things that really surprised me. One was how early people ate dinner. I mean, it was 4:30 and the dining hall was open. The sun was still shining. It didn't make any sense to me. The other thing, and this is an indication of traffic, I guess, in India, I remember writing an email. If I still had my Hotmail account, I'd have access to these emails. But I remember writing an email to a good friend of mine laughing about the fact that people stopped at stop signs. I remember walking and this car just like blaring music, bunch of teenagers, like smoke billowing out the windows, they're screeching down the road, music blaring, and then they stopped at the stop sign. And I was like, what kind of rebellious attitude is this? I laughed so hard. And now I think back and I'm horrified that I thought that was so funny. But yeah, people stopped at stop signs.
So now when you go back to India, you stop at stop signs.
And I'm the most dangerous driver on the road because I am, according to Indian drivers, the most unpredictable person because I'm stopping at intersections. Doesn't make any sense.
The cultural dominance of America is just terrible.
It's terrible. We're terrible trying to bring our culture to other countries. It's crazy.
So then, okay, let's kind of go to what you do now. How did you make this transition from fundraising the software then to improv?
Yeah, in retrospect, I did it very kind of methodically. In the moment, it felt like I was kind of going all over the place. But as a software developer, I worked for a small startup in Chicago, and we kind of got sold for parts. And the part that I was working on got sold to Union Pacific Railroad based in Omaha. And I decided, I politely declined their request for me to move to Omaha. I said, I'll work from Chicago. And I tell people this a lot who are thinking about their careers and jobs. If you want to figure out if you love what you do it for 8 hours a day by yourself at home. Mm-hmm. And it was a great indication for me that I hated programming, and I didn't enjoy it. I was fine at it. I wasn't great at it. I was fine at it, and I was making good money. And I was like, I kind of want to do something different. And so I spent about 6 months. I was fortunate, right? I had a job, but I spent about 6 months kind of meeting different people in different careers and understanding what they did, just doing informational interviews. And I found that fundraising was something that kind of appealed to me. I am, I'm a progressive at heart. I want to give back. I wanted to feel some sort of impact of what I was doing. And so I worked for a hospital foundation. And I loved it. I loved doing what I was doing. I was there for 5 years. And I had a series of incidents that happened that exposed me to an organization that was even closer to my heart, an organization called Room to Read that worked in Zambia, worked in India. It was around literacy for children and girls' education for girls transitioning from primary to secondary school. A lot of the things that I cared pretty deeply about. And that job brought me to San Francisco.
So then how did you explain to your parents the transition from engineer to nonprofit fundraiser?
Yeah, I'm not sure that they fully accepted it, yet. Well, it's funny because at the time, fundraising as a career was not necessarily a viable career in India. It is now, and this isn't that long ago. I'm not that old, but it still was a weird thing for them, right? And so I explained it as I want to do something different, and I want to do this, and I think they had already, understood that I was going to find my own path. But I remember my mother said, well, I tell people you work at the hospital, and then they just assume what it is you do. But yeah, so it was, I'm fortunate in that my parents are pretty open-minded when it comes to things like that, and so there wasn't ever a, you shouldn't do this. I mean, my dad was, I think now that I have children, was rightfully concerned that I was going into a field that he didn't see a lot of growth in. But again, the fundraising landscape in India at the time is very different than it is here, and here it's obviously a rich and vibrant career.
But it's, for my parents, it's kind of the same thing, open-minded, but, for the longest time, I'm not sure they really understood what I do. Yeah. Right? It takes a lot for, we're very fortunate to have parents that just say, okay, you don't have to be X, Y, or Z according to the formula of their community or their peers. Yeah. So that's special.
Yeah, it is. I'm very lucky to have the parents that I have and the spouse that I have, because she was also a big factor in saying, yeah, you should do this, right? Yeah. And so I was fortunate in that way. But if you think explaining fundraising to your parents is difficult, try improviser.
Tell me how that goes.
I'll tell you when I figure it out. But no, so I went from fundraising, and then my transition to software sales was actually a little bit easier. But each time I've made a career transition, what I've been lucky enough to find is a person who's willing to hire someone for fit rather than for skills. So I got really lucky with the leaders that I worked with, and then as I did that and I the company that I worked for got acquired by LinkedIn, and we started working at LinkedIn, I started realizing that some of the skills that I was using to be a successful fundraiser and a successful salesperson were basically improv skills. And I got into improv, and I started studying improv and doing a lot of work around it. And that's what kind of brought me to Speechless.
So Speechless, we've been working together a little bit just over the last day, and I've gotten to know your partner in the business, Anthony. It's an interesting and very helpful way to kind of think about how you deliver a message. So, I don't know, if you can break that down.
Yeah, absolutely. A focus for us at Speechless is to help people find their voice. And something we say quite a bit is be yourself and be heard. And we find that the best way for people to be able to tell their story or to find their authentic voice and amplify that voice is to find a way to tell that story in a way that is compelling and authentic. And a lot of the skills that go into making good improvisers good at what they do and good jazz musicians good at what they do is the ability to be in the moment, is the ability to draw from personal experience, is the ability to tell a story in a way that resonates with the audience that they're speaking with. And so often we have, you might have someone who's delivered a great TED Talk, but it's because they've delivered that TED Talk 100,000 times, they've practiced it and they've delivered and they keep doing it, and at some point it stops feeling authentic. And our focus is on giving people the skills that they need to be in the moment, and then based on who they're speaking with, understanding which parts of their story they need to tell, which parts of their story they can amplify, but also empowering them to speak up in situations where they might feel like traditionally they haven't been allowed to speak up. So we work a lot with minorities, with immigrants, with women in tech, any sort of community that is not part of the traditional majority in that industry. And it's amazing the stories that we hear back from people, because they say, I was able to, ask for that raise, or I was able to stand up for this person who was, being harassed or whatever it is. But it kind of runs the gamut of experiences, because if you are able to kind of embody some of these, what we call improv thinking skills, it makes you a more present person. And a more present person is a more empathetic person. It's someone who actively listens to the person sitting across from them. And I think it's a phenomenal way to start to bridge this communication gap that we have with people that don't think the way we do, don't sound like us, don't look like us.
So it leads me to kind of, oftentimes I'll get the question of kind of how do you do what you do? And my response is always that I know who I am. I am not an immigrant, right? My parents immigrated here. I was fortunate enough to be born in the United States. So when I'm advocating for immigrants and immigration, I'm not advocating for myself. And there's this kind of
arm's length,
right?
Yeah.
So then taking what you do and thinking about kind of the courage that an immigrant yourself brings to that conversation about immigrants and immigration and the need to change our policies, how would you kind of sit down with, say, a dreamer, and how do you bring out that story of that dreamer or that farm worker, so that they can sit down with a member of Congress and say, you know what, this is why we need to address the system?
Yeah, it's, luckily I have a one-sentence solution. Well, I mean,
it's a podcast, we can sit here for days.
But I think a big caveat here is that not all immigrants are created equal, right? I came into the United States in a very different way than the dreamer did or the farm laborer did. And it's because I was immensely privileged. I won the lottery of life. Right? I happened to be born to parents who were educated, who had the means to put me through successful kind of high school education and a college education, and who emphasized the need for a college education. So I already came in with all of these kind of privileged milk crates that I was standing on. And so I still come at it in my story is very different. And so I don't think that I could sit here and just be like, oh, this is all you need to do. Just move to Iowa, become friends with farmers, and you're good. Because a lot of those folks have moved to Iowa, and they are friends with farmers, and they're not good. But I think it is really about being, again, I don't want to sound like this is prescriptive in any way, but my story in Iowa is very indicative of kind of the national conversation, which is that on an individual level, if you can connect with someone, you start to have a very different perspective than at the policy level. So the reason that a lot of people who've never been to Iowa think about Iowa as a very conservative Republican state that is anti-immigrant, for example, is because they just look at the policies. They see the headlines about laws that are being passed or whatever. But if you're there on the ground, on those, and you can easily tell if someone's never been to Iowa because they would say Iowa was flat. And then if you ask anyone who's ever ridden a bike in Iowa, they would know that it absolutely is not.
Right, right.
And so that's kind of the difference in perspective, right? At the 50,000 view, it looks flat and the same, but on the ground, you see all the ups and downs.
That's right. I've driven through Iowa multiple times, and there's nothing flat about it.
There's nothing. There's a bike ride called Ragbri, which is the annual bike ride across Iowa, and it is not easy. So that, I think, is the key there, is how do we get people to have personal connections?
Yeah.
So I don't think it's about getting the dreamer or the farm laborer to be able to tell their story. I think it's about getting the policymakers to listen to their stories.
Yeah.
And so much of what we do is kind of this double-edged sword. We're helping people, we're empowering them to find their voice and amplify it and be authentic. But at the same time, we are helping train the people who traditionally have been talking the loudest to sit back and listen. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is an equally difficult skill to teach. People always say, public speaking is my biggest fear. I never want to be a public speaker. What you never hear is the person saying, I love public speaking. I never want to listen, even though that's equally difficult for that person. Yeah. So I think it's more about helping those folks sit at the table and listen, give the time of day, because I don't need to tell a dreamer or a farm laborer how to tell their authentic story. They've got it.
Right.
And it's a compelling story, and it's a personal story. And they don't need to practice it a million times because they've lived it. But to teach the senator and the congressperson to sit down and listen, that's, I think, the tough part.
That's a great point. So, tough segue here.
Yeah.
How did you come up with this show, this improv show you and Anthony do?
Well, actually, it's not necessarily a tough segue. It's a very organic segue because, so Anthony and I do a show called American Immigrants. And Anthony is a world-class improviser, freestyle rapper. He's got a show on Broadway and all of that fun stuff. And he and I became friends, and we started talking about ways that we could collaborate and perform together. And one of the things that I feel really strongly about is this idea of personal connection. I feel very strongly that a lot of the biggest social movements that have happened in the United States and across the world have happened not because of policy changes, but rather because at the individual level, people have started to understand that they have more in common with folks than they have differences. It seems like a very kind of pithy, trite comment to say, but it's true. If you think about the gay civil rights movement, when more people started coming out, more people started to realize that their brothers and sisters were gay, their neighbors were gay, and that they had been friends with them for 50 years, or had raised them, and they started to realize, well, this is not an aberration. This is a part of normal life. My feeling is that if you can personally identify with an immigrant story, if you can understand that every single person in the United States, whether Native American, Black American, or white American, has an immigrant story or a family immigrant story, it makes it easier to stop othering the word immigrant, right? That word has been kind of vilified. And so this is our attempt at kind of reclaiming the word immigrant, being proud of it, but not being proud of it in the way of saying, I'm better because I'm an immigrant, because there is this ongoing narrative that immigrants are important because they do so much for the country. And I really want to push this idea that everyone is an immigrant and everyone's a human being, so we should treat everyone with respect, not because they happen to be a CEO of a company, because that's the story you keep hearing. Like 80% of companies are, whatever the numbers are. And so we came up with this show concept where we talk to the audience and we pick a random last name. And typically we try to pick a last name that doesn't sound like a quote-unquote immigrant last name. And we ask that person for their family history. Who was the first person from your family to come to the United States? Why did they come here? When did they come here? What did they do when they got here? Those kinds of questions. And then based on that, we create a song, we create scenes, and it's all fully improvised and made up in the moment. And we tie the whole thing together. And then a lot of times we'll just have conversations with the audience about it. And a big thing that comes out of it is the person who answers the questions, has to kind of rack their brains to figure out and answer the questions. But what we've heard is in an audience of 100, when one person answers, 99 people are sitting there thinking, what's my story?
Right.
And there's so many people I got to call my mom. I got to figure out where we came from and what our story is. And, we've spoken to people someone who had immigrated here 6 months before we had the show, and then someone whose family had come here 7 generations ago. They come to California 7 generations ago, which means they were some of the first white settlers. He was doing okay. But, you know, those are the kinds of stories that we get, and we're trying to take it in front of audiences that we would like to have that feeling.
Are you going to take it back to Grinnell?
I would love to. Yeah. We actually almost did. I went and I spoke at a class in Grinnell earlier this year, or earlier last year, I should say. And I really, Anthony couldn't come at the time, but I really wanted to do the show while we were there. Of course, he was convenient that he couldn't come because it was February 11th in Grinnell, Iowa, and it was negative 30 degrees.
That's bloody cold.
Yeah. To try that as a fresh off the plane immigrant, I mean, I was like, what am I doing here?
All right, so last question for you. The name of the podcast is Only in America. So I ask everybody this question. Just finish the sentence. Only in America, ... As an improv, the bar is very high for you, so no pressure whatsoever.
Well, I told you this story earlier, and I want to tell the story because that is an Only in America moment. But only in America can your first night in Iowa involve tying an office chair to the back of a pickup truck and getting pulled around a parking lot in a sport called quote-unquote chair sailing that devolves into a chair being just kind of flung around while sparks fly and cheering. Like, that is an Only in America moment. When people ask me if we cow-tipped in Iowa, I said, nope, we respected our farm animals way too much. We hated office furniture, though.
Vivek, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Support for the National Immigration Forum comes from the Carnegie Corporation of New York, supporting innovations in education, democratic engagement, and strengthening international peace and security. And from Humanity United. When humanity is united, we can bring a powerful force for human dignity.
One way people feel like they can connect to conversations on immigration is by reflecting on their own or their family's immigrant heritage. That evening after the training, we got to hear how a typical show plays out for Vivek and Anthony's American Immigrants. In this performance, they asked a member of the audience, a fellow, about their family's immigrant heritage, and then created a song about it on the spot.
I think we have the title of the song.
All the math.
All the Maths. A Viking secret. Shall we?
I think we should.
Okay.
You're going my way, I'm going your way. I'll teach that math because I am from Norway. You're going my way, I'm going your way. I'll teach some math because I am from Norway. I am from Norway, and the shores, they call me back there. I'm thinking that the Vikings probably just had something special for them. They had alchemy and also understanding metallurgy, so they could just conquer the people in the north of the Scandinavian Sea. Alright, so going back to the Danes on attack when they went to go to England. Yeah, hell that, there was so much seed that they spilled in the blood and the rivers they were running, everybody they were gunning. Alright, but then the Nords stood strong against the Swedes and against the Finns. They were like, no, we don't belong with them. We are our own damn people. How we do we know it? There's an algorithm that we could easily do, or we could add it up. Maybe 2 + 2 could equal 5, 6, 7, 8. It's a secret in this Viking state. If you're going my way, I'm going your way. Some math, 'cause I am from Norway. If you're going my way, I'll go your way. I'll teach that math because I am from Norway. But the shores, because they saw us off. We went across the seas like Lusitania. Oh yeah, we were kinda insane, yeah. Settled in the middle of a U.S. island nation. Why did we do it? Cause it kinda had the same climate that we used to. So we just had lakes and we had ice fishing and everything that happened, yeah, we were on a mission. It got missing because we didn't like to tell things about our feelings and from where we came. So my grandchildren never understood a damn thing about the Norge and why we made it here. So you're going my way, I'll go your way. I'll teach some math because I am from Norway. Woo! If you're going my way, I'll go your way. I'll teach some math because I am from Norway.
Thank you for sharing that. So yes, so that's the beginning of usually our show, and then thereafter we would do scenes based out of that song, and then we would somehow come back to that song at the end, and we would finish the evening by tying all the various storylines back to somehow meaning of the song. So that's American Immigrants, and we try to do that in places all around the United States so that conversations happen afterward where they say, I don't know anything about my grandparents, or how could you not know anything?
I should call my mom. I should call my mom. I should call my mom. I should ask her what happened.
Yeah.
Vivek Venugopal is the Director of Revenue at Speechless Inc. You can find more information on Vivek at our website, immigrationforum.org/podcast. And while you're there, subscribe to Only in America to stay up to date when new episodes are released. And finally, thank you for listening to Only in America. Our work in the National Immigration Forum through this podcast is about redefining the immigration conversation. 2 seasons and more than 100 episodes in, your support is helping reshape our nation's immigration story. As we approach the end of the year, please consider supporting the forum at immigrationforum.org. Only in America is produced and edited by Emily Chow, Joanna Taylor, and Megan Wetmore. I'm Ali Nirani, and I will talk to you next week.